Good evening. My name is Louise Clément. I am a member of the Council on Aging of Ottawa's Age-Friendly Housing Committee, and I will be your moderator for tonight's event, which is entitled Speak Up for Age-Friendly Housing, a key issue for voters of all ages. Our session will touch on the full spectrum of housing for older adults, from home ownership all the way to residential living, including various options, such as condo living, renting an apartment, co-living, etc. Although changes to long-term care are critically needed, we will not have the time in this seminar to discuss issues related to long-term care. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that the land on which we are holding this virtual event is the traditional unceded territory of the Anishinaabe Algonquin people. The theme of tonight's event is particularly relevant to Indigenous populations who face many challenges in relation to housing, including their older adults. I would also like to recognize that we have among us a number of candidates for the municipal elections, and I would like to invite them to introduce themselves as through the chat function. We are so pleased to have so many participants to tonight's event, and we'd like to welcome all of you. Let me say a few words about the language of tonight's event. All presentations will be made in English. However, presentation material will be displayed in both official languages, and questions can be asked in French during the question periods. Bonsoir, mon nom est Louise Clément. Je suis membre du comité sur le logement, amie des aînés du Conseil sur le vieillissement d'Ottawa, et je serai votre facilitatrice pour la session de ce soir qui est intitulée « Le logement, ami des aînés, un enjeu clé pour les électeurs de tout âge ». La session de ce soir portera sur le logement pour les aînés dans un sens large, incluant entre autres être propriétaire d'une maison ou condo, être locataire, vivre en cohabitation, etc. Les résidences de soins de longue durée font face à des défis importants en ce moment. Cependant, faute de temps, notre événement de ce soir ne touchera pas ces enjeux. Avant de commencer, j'aimerais d'abord souligner que les terres sur lesquelles nous tenons cet événement virtuel font partie du territoire traditionnel non cédé du peuple Anishinaabe algonquin. Le thème de la session de ce soir est d'importance particulière pour les peuples autochtones qui font face à de nombreux défis liés au logement, incluant leurs aînés. J'aimerais aussi souligner que nous avons parmi nous, à notre session de ce soir, certains candidats aux élections municipales, et j'aimerais les inviter à se présenter dans la fonction chat. Nous sommes très heureux d'avoir une si grande participation à notre événement de ce soir et bienvenue à tous. Quelques mots sur la langue de la session de ce soir. Les présentations seront faites en anglais. Par contre, tout le matériel de présentation sera diffusé dans les deux langues officielles et vous pourrez poser vos questions en français. The theme of tonight's event is Speak Up for Age-Friendly Housing, a key issue for all ages. Why is this an important topic at this point in time? Ottawa's over 65 population currently represents about 17% of the population, and it is expected to reach 25% by 2035. In the context of Ottawa's housing crisis and homelessness emergency, critical needs of older adults are currently unmet. A window of opportunity is upon us with the elections coming up this October 24th. A new council will be elected, and it will be their responsibility to look at the issues regarding housing and to find solutions to the problems. And it will be important that the needs of older adults also be considered as part of their analysis and solutions. As we begin the discussion, we'd like you to think about what home means to you. And we'd like to ask you to write down in one word or a few words in the chat function what it means to you. Later on, Valerie will go over some of the comments as part of her presentation. Now, a few words on the Council on Aging of Ottawa. We have a history of more than 45 years of service in Ottawa and almost 500 members. Our mission reads, as a bilingual and inclusive council, we work to advance the well-being of Ottawa's older adults. If you are not already a member and you like what you see tonight, you are invited to become a member tonight. Let's go over some technical details. Please note, this event will be recorded to share with our other members and subscribers. To avoid any disruptions caused by noise or any kind of audio feedback, participants will be muted and their video feeds will be turned off during the presentations. We will send everyone an email early next week with a copy of tonight's presentations, a link to the recording, as well as links to relevant information in both official languages. We also want you to know that if you experience any technical issues during tonight's session, you can reach out to us for help. You can do so by sending a private message to Zoom help via the Zoom chat feature. Any questions you want to ask our speakers should be submitted via the Q&A function. We will be moderating the chat as well as the Q&A, and we will respond to your tech support questions as we go. We also encourage participants who have interesting information or links that they would like to share with other participants to do so in the chat function. Now, the objectives of tonight's session. We will provide you with information on critical housing needs of older adults in Ottawa. We will present the analysis of key issues in Ottawa that was conducted by the Council on Aging, as well as their key recommendations to the City of Ottawa to address these issues. And we will encourage civic engagement and political action with candidates and city councillors in the municipal election. Our agenda will be divided in three parts. First, there will be a presentation by Valerie Wright on the Council on Aging's analysis and recommendations to the City of Ottawa regarding housing for older adults. Second, we will look at what is possible and promising. Dr. Carolyn Whitman will provide data and analysis on key housing issues and possibilities for older adults in Ottawa. And Jenny Brooks will talk about an interesting model to address the housing needs of older adults, the naturally occurring needs. And third, Peggy Edwards will animate a discussion on what you can do to engage the city. We will be taking some time for questions at the end of each part of the agenda. And as a reminder, please submit your questions through the Q&A function, which is right next to the chat function. And now, without any further delay, let me introduce our first speaker, Valerie Wright. Valerie is a retired teacher, principal from the Ottawa Catholic School Board. She is a member of the Council on Aging Age-Friendly Housing Committee, in which she has played a key role in the last 2 years as the lead on the advocacy subcommittee. Her presentation will look at key issues with respect to age-friendly housing in Ottawa, as well as recommendations to the city to improve the situation. Over to you, Valerie.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us this evening. Despite some of the competition out there on Zoom this evening, I'm so glad you decided to join us at the Council of Aging webinar. We all have a vision of what home means to us, and there's quite a difference between house and home. And we've already started the conversation. So what does home mean to you? And the one sort of qualifier that comes out a lot in the conversation, which is kind of interesting, is home is a safe place for me, adequate and safe, secure. So safety seems to be a primary wish for our home. And I know when I was writing my list, safety was the first thing on the list. The other thing that comes out is a place where I can spend time with the people that I love, my family. I feel comfortable, loved, and secure. And a place to create memories, a place where we can have family meals. I'm thinking of Thanksgiving next week, and many of us will be looking forward to maybe the first time in a few years where we're able to gather around the table with family members. It's convenient, welcoming, and another comment that came out was intergenerational, and I love that comment where people of many different ages can gather together and enjoy each other's company and wisdom and love. So a place to call home, a basic human right for each one of us. Surveys show that an overwhelming majority, almost 100% of older adults want to live independently in their own homes for as long as possible, where they feel confident, comfortable, safe, and able to maintain social connections with their friends and families. On October the 1st, we will be electing a council who will determine the future of our city. We are hoping that our presentation this evening will give you the background you need to inform our future decision makers on what we need to become an age-friendly city. Our age-friendly housing committee is made up of about 15 mostly older adult volunteers with a few key advisors, including a representative from the city planning department. Our purpose in a nutshell is to explore and advocate for age-friendly housing on the continuum from independent living to long-term care for older people in the Ottawa region. We produce resources and develop workshops, which can be found on our website. While we do not consider ourselves experts, we bring a passion and lived experience to our concern about the availability of quality housing and choice for older adults in our city. Through research and consultation, we have developed a list of recommendations that we feel the city needs to consider in its planning for the future. You will have received a copy of our municipal platform when you registered. What is an age-friendly world? It is a world in which you would want to grow older. According to the definition given by the World Health Organization, age-friendly environments foster healthy and active aging. They enable older adults to age safely in a place that is right for them, to be free from poverty, to continue to develop personally, and to contribute to their communities while retaining autonomy, health, and dignity. Many factors are needed to create an age-friendly city. As you can see on this diagram, these factors form a complex web of interacting needs. They cannot be addressed in isolation. When all are in place, they produce a rich and diverse community for all. And then age-friendly housing. It's not a one-size-fits-all approach. Age-friendly housing addresses the need for creating more adaptable and inclusive housing choices that promote just not new models of construction, but health, social equity, connectivity, mobility, and public engagement. When people at different life stages live side by side, collaboration between generations leads to a stronger, more vibrant community. A housing option such as a retirement residence or moving in with one's children may work for someone at a particular age, but it might not be good for someone else. And then there's the fact that the needs of older adults change over time. What kind of city do you want to live in? The Council of Aging defines age-friendly housing as the 4 A's. Housing is affordable when it costs less than 30% of your before-tax income. In Ottawa, 25% of older adults are renters, with 54% of those spending 50% of their income on housing. A bit high. In Ottawa, that means that even with an income of $60,000 to $70,000 a year, you will not be able to afford a market rate 1-bedroom apartment rental, which is currently over $1,600 a month, or a 2-bedroom, which is just over $2,000. The more vulnerable in our society face huge challenges when trying to find a place to live. Accessible. As we age, homes may need modifications that will allow us to live independently with a health, disability, or mobility issue. Accessible housing is designed to meet those needs. For example, the need for 1-level, no-step entrance, wider doorways, step-in showers, and a wheelchair accessible bathroom on the main floor. Is your home appropriate? Is your home appropriate for your needs? Is your home safe, clean, secure, and well-maintained? Does your home have access to the transportation, amenities, and services? Does your home meet your unique living and lifestyle needs, such as gardening, pets, privacy, walking paths? And most important, does your home encourage social contact and reduced isolation? The fourth A, is your home available? Do options exist for the kind of home you want to live in, or are there long wait lists for the kind of home you need? Housing options that would allow us to live in our own neighborhoods or near family are often very limited or expensive. Wait lists are common for seniors who need help to pay for housing or long-term care. Currently, over 4,000 older adult households on the wait list for social housing. And 2,700 seniors are on a waiting list for long-term care. In January 2020, the City of Ottawa declared a housing crisis and homelessness emergency. It's not news that home ownership and rental costs are spiraling up. You may have read Andre Picard's article this week where he writes in the Globe and Mail that the affordability crisis is hitting seniors hard. Ottawa's new official plan calls for a new urban design, and leadership is needed to look at questions of housing diversity and support a dramatic shift to mixed urban forms and socially integrated housing for people of all ages and income. Older adults face difficulty in finding housing, especially those on fixed incomes. Many have insufficient funds to modify their existing homes to accommodate changes in functionality and ability, and there exist large gaps in the availability of home care services and supports that can help older people age in place and in community. This is a crisis. Ottawa's population is projected to grow by 400,000 people over the next 25 years, and over 195 housing units will be needed by 2046. Our recommendations. 2 years ago, our Age-Friendly Housing Committee began to define what we believe are the most important recommendations to improve housing for older adults in Ottawa. After a lengthy process, we narrowed our list down to 5. I'm sure you can point to other needs, but we felt it was important to focus on the most important interventions to begin with. Recommendation number 1. The city must increase the number of available and affordable housing options, including rental units, to match older adults' demographic place in our city. This means ensuring that 18% of new units are suitable for older adults right now, moving to 25% by 2036. Affordable and accessible housing must be central to city planning and needs to be considered as part of the public good in much the same way as schools, libraries, hospitals, arenas, and community centers. In addition, the city's new official plan needs to establish and adhere to a consistent income to rent ratio for rental housing targets, i.e. rent based on a percentage of a person's income and linked to the city's 10-year housing and homelessness plan. How can we achieve this? Our recommendation states that the city commit to progressive funding for affordable housing stock to $30 million per year with increasing investments in the following year. Ideally, this money would go to nonprofit and co-op housing initiatives, with rentals being high on the priority list. We are happy to say that the city is committed close to this amount this year, but we know that this is not nearly enough to solve the crisis. We have listed here a list of tools that the city can implement to achieve more affordable housing. We do not have the time to go into detail here, but there are tools and there is hope out there. There are solutions. And as citizens, we can become more engaged, follow, and give input to the decisions of Ottawa City Council. A good way to do this is to become involved with the community associations in your ward. Recommendation number 2. Incorporate the principles of universal design in all new builds and ensure that 20% of all retrofits are accessible. Universal design, also called inclusive design or barrier-free design, is the design and structure of an environment so it can be understood, accessed, and used to the greatest extent possible, regardless of people's age or ability. The challenge: the city needs to support and advocate for the development of common standards of accessibility, i.e. building codes, across all levels of government. Federal, provincial, and municipal governments all need to have the same definition. Recommendation number 3, Invest in innovative building models that encourage connections and relationships. A home is more than a building with four walls. Our aging population is diverse, with a wide range of income levels, family structures, gender identities, ethnic backgrounds, and physical and mental abilities. We need more imagination to build affordable rental units, more modest homes, and small multifamily units that meet housing needs to accommodate and integrate the diverse groups in our society. Not to mention the 1,400 people in Ottawa who do not have a bed to sleep in tonight. Some examples include multi-generational housing. Denmark has a model. You may have seen this profiled on CBC recently. Excellent model. Co-living, you remember the Golden Girls. Co-op housing, and Norc's naturally occurring housing communities, of which you will learn more about in one of our presentations later. Recommendation number 4. Facilitate the coordination of public health services with health teams, community organizations, and other stakeholders to expand the range of home and community care support services. Canada spends a meager 0.2% of GDP on home care and has one of the lowest allocations to home care in the OECD. On top of that, the ratio of more than $6 spent on institutional care for every dollar spent on home care is one of the most imbalanced resource allocations in the developed world. Many countries spend more on home care, Denmark being a good example again. A more integrated approach to the coordination of public health services with health teams, community organizations, and stakeholders would offer hope for a more holistic approach to health and well-being. And finally, recommendation number 5, appoint an older adult advocate whose mandate would include housing in the list of issues affecting older adults, leading to the development of a comprehensive housing plan to meet the diverse housing needs of older adults. The changing demographic of Ottawa calls for a broader spectrum of health and social service policies that will allow Canadian seniors to age at home. The City of Ottawa can be commended for developing and implementing 3 older adult plans, the most recent being in 2020-22. However, the city must demonstrate leadership with and for older adults by identifying and appointing an independent older adult advocate, ensuring that the voice of older adults are heard and included in government decision-making. We have a first federal housing advocate, Marie-Josée Houle. It is now time for an older adult advocate at Ottawa City Hall. There are no doubt challenges to building age-friendly housing. The first 4 challenges are common for the planning of all affordable housing. A consistent definition of affordable is needed. 30% of income versus a percentage of average market rate is not the same. And the complexity of the application process for plan approval can be pretty overwhelming, especially for the nonprofit sector, as well as the complexity of the integration of health and social services with housing. Canadian municipalities are constrained by limited fiscal revenue, relying heavily on property taxes as a source of revenue. Intergovernmental funding and coordination is fundamental to successful housing policy. The final factor, combating ageism, is unique to the older adult demographic. Ageism affects how we think, feel, and act towards others and ourselves based on age. It imposes powerful barriers to the development of good policies and programs for older and younger people, and can have profound negative consequences on older adults' health and well-being. It is only through concerted and coordinated action that we can create a world for all ages. A major benefit for the city in keeping older adults at a classic institution is cost effectiveness, and that gets everyone's attention. To give you an example, it costs approximately $1,000 a day for a hospital bed. A private room in long-term care averages around $2,200 a month. Assisted living averages around $4,500 a month, whereas home care estimates are at about $40 a day for 2 hours. Other benefits include older adults are consumers, generating income for their community. They often work and they are entrepreneurs. They volunteer and they support extended family. Finally, and important to me, is supporting housing for older adults will affirm and respect the equal place that older adults have in our society. Ottawa's new official plan seeks to create a livable, vibrant, and resilient city where there's a range of housing types that meet needs across life stages and affordability levels. We are at a crossroads, and this is a turning point in how we see our city develop and grow into the 21st century. Something to think about. What is your vision of Ottawa as we grow into the 21st century, and how are we going to get there? I cannot even imagine not having a safe, warm place to rest my head each night. If this basic need for housing is not met, the impacts for the health and mental health of our society are enormous. We at the Council on Aging are calling for immediate attention to the lack of suitable age-friendly housing options for older adults in Ottawa, particularly those with low and modest incomes. But we need you. Our voices matter, and working together, we can create an age-friendly city for everyone. Following our guest speakers, we will tell you how you can become engaged in our campaign in speaking up for age-friendly housing and getting it on the next City Council agenda. Thank you for your very kind attention. We may have a few minutes here to answer some of your questions before we continue on with our guest speakers, and I will turn it back over to Louise.
Thank you, Valerie, for this very interesting presentation and for sharing your knowledge and insights on key issues to housing for older adults in Ottawa, as well as the recommendations that our analysis led to in terms of recommendations for the city. I see we have a couple of questions. I believe actually that the question that was asked, the person is saying now that you have answered the question as part of the presentation. So at this point in time, unless someone else wants to ask a question, I believe we may be able to move on to the next presentation. So we will do that. It will leave us more time at the end for further questions, and feel free to ask more questions for Valerie if they come to mind as we move along with the rest of tonight's event. So we can move on now to the second part of tonight's event, looking at what's possible and what's promising. And it is now my pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Carolyn Whitman. Carolyn is an adjunct professor and housing researcher at the University of Ottawa. She was the lead researcher for the 6-year community research program, Transforming Housing, Affordable Housing for All at the University of Melbourne in Australia. Her presentation will provide data and analysis on key housing issues and possibilities for older adults in Ottawa. And Carolyn, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Louise. And thank you very much to the Council on Aging for inviting me tonight. I should say before I begin that my slides were fairly wordy in English before they were sent for translation. There's a lot of numbers in them, and I think there's already been one request from Sean Devine for the PDF. There will be a PDF available afterwards. So if I'm throwing a lot of numbers at you, don't worry, you can look them up afterwards. So I am a University of Melbourne. I'm actually working with a project that I'm going to be talking about tonight that's based at UBC in Vancouver called the Housing Assessment Resource Tools Project, which has been funded by the CMHC. Next slide, please, Valerie. So the impetus for this research is Canada's return to housing policy after 3 decades of national neglect. And it's an exciting moment for Canada. The National Housing Strategy was announced in 2017, and it had very clear definitions and targets. Unfortunately, a lot of the programs and initiatives that have come out of it have sort of ignored those targets, unfortunately. So one of the targets is to have 530,000 households removed from housing need across Canada. Almost 1.7 million households were in housing need according to the 2016 census. I'm going to be speaking tomorrow actually about the 2021 census and what's happened there, but the housing strategy comes out of the 2016 census. And a second target was to eliminate chronic homelessness by 2030. Unfortunately, and I think Valerie has already touched on this, there's a huge difference between looking at affordable housing in terms of what you can afford, which is the logical and indeed the CMHC definition of affordable housing, which is 30% of before tax income. If you looked across Canada at the average rent for the average household in core housing need, that would be a maximum of $575 per month. But if you look at the average rents in the largest program under the National Housing Strategy, that comes out to closer to $2,000 a month because it's not based on the CMHC's own definition of affordability. It's based on a kind of ersatz definition, but it's a little bit closer to area median rent. Next slide, please, Valerie. So again, there's a pretty clear definition of what core housing need, this measurement that the CMHC has been using, is about. And it has some resemblance to at least one of the A's that Valerie was talking about. So you're in core need if you are spending more than 30% of your pre-tax household income on rent or mortgage plus energy costs. You're in housing need if you're living in a home that needs major repairs, plumbing, structural, electrical. And you're also in core housing need if you don't have enough bedrooms in your house for the size of your household. Now, that measurement of core housing need doesn't include, Statistics Canada, when it's counting up things in the census, doesn't include people who are homeless or living in emergency shelters, because you need to be in a private home. That also means that it doesn't include the needs of people living in congregate housing, like long-term care or in a rooming house. And most sort of absurdly to me, actually all three of them are absurd, it doesn't include students under the age of 35 because being a student is considered a temporary condition and almost one of voluntary poverty. But of course, not having adequate housing is a huge impediment to education for lower income people. Next slide, Valerie. We already mentioned housing as a right. In 2019, Canada adopted something called the National Housing Strategy Act, which commits all governments in Canada, not just the federal government, but the provincial government and the municipal government, the City of Ottawa, to progressively realize the right to adequate housing. And international covenants that have been signed by Canada and many other nations in the United Nations goes beyond affordable and habitable and sufficient size to start dealing with some of the issues that we're talking about tonight. Accessibility, particularly for people who have mobility constraints, who can be of any age, of course, but as we get older, we're more likely to have physical or intellectual constraints. It talks about well-located housing. I think one of the people mentioned 15-minute cities. So, you know, the ability to be part of a supportive community near health services, near parks, near transit. It includes security of tenure, and it includes something called cultural adequacy, which has something to do with that sociability issue that Valerie was talking about. It also very much has to do with the need for a separate for Indigenous by Indigenous strategy, which the Government of Canada is committed to, but is not yet enacted. Unfortunately, the CMHC hasn't really defined the last two terms or really measured the amount of housing that is accessible or well located. And there needs to be clear definitions and clear measurements to know whether we're doing well in a national strategy, a provincial strategy, or a municipal strategy. Next slide, please, Valerie. So in comes the Housing Assessment Resource Tools project, and we are working on three kinds of tools. The first tool is a housing need assessment tool, which looks at housing need and maximum affordable costs across 5 income categories. It also looks at household size, and it looks at priority populations, including household heads over 65 and household heads over 85. So we're analyzing census data to obtain these kinds of statistics, which might inform strategies at all levels of government, because we're doing it not only at the national level, but for every province, territory, region, and municipality. The second tool that we're working with, and I have to say the City of Ottawa has been a great ally in this tool, is assessing and scoring available, appropriate government and nonprofit land that's close to services and amenities, zoned residential, that could be used for nonprofit housing. And the third tool that we're looking at, which is just a matter of time before Canada adopts, is a property acquisition strategy that allows us to look at the net loss of affordable housing through acquiring places that are at risk of being lost. So in Ottawa, 7 homes, affordable homes, were lost between 2011 and 2016 for every 1 affordable home built at $750 a month or less. Next slide, please, Valerie. We're working with 13 governments across Canada, ranging from the Yukon Territory, where I'm speaking next week, to both Ottawa and Gatineau and the 6 governments within the Greater Toronto and Hamilton area. Next slide, please, Valerie. I'm going to flip through these slides. Oh, great. We also have a large advisory committee. So when we're looking at income categories, for instance, in Ottawa, the median in 2016 was about $86,000, and that meant that the average income could afford a shelter cost, let's say a rent of $2,150 a month. And I should mention that I'm playing around with the 2021 data now, and the shelter cost for owners is not that much higher than the shelter cost for renters. I'm just mentioning that as a fact that the shelter amounts for renters has gone up quite a bit. We look at 5 categories. The first category are basically people on social assistance, very much at risk of homelessness, and about 6% of the households are in that category. They can afford a maximum of $430 a month. The next category, low income, this gives a sense of their annual incomes. They can afford a little over $1,000 a month, and that sort of equates to minimum wage. The third category, moderate income households, can afford between $1,000 and $1,700 a month. That would equate to young professionals or to people who are in education, health, for instance. Then there's average income households and, of course, higher income households. Next slide, please, Valerie. So let's look at core housing need. I don't think it would surprise anyone that almost 70% of the households, very low income households, are in core housing need. That means that their housing is unaffordable and or overcrowded and or uninhabitable. When we look at low-income households, again, it's a much higher number of households, and it's over 50% of low-income households are in core housing need, including many people on fixed incomes, of course. And there's a lower number of moderate income households or lower proportion, I should say, of moderate income households who are in housing need. Next slide, please. So this is just the deficit from 2016. This doesn't talk about net loss of affordable housing. It doesn't talk about population growth. There's almost 50,000 households in Ottawa who are in core housing need. And as you can see, the vast majority of them can afford at most $1,000 a month. And those are really scary numbers. What's even more scary, and I'd like to reiterate this, is it doesn't include people who are unsheltered in emergency shelters. It doesn't include the 50,000 students in Ottawa, only 10% of whom live in residence, and sometimes the residences are quite expensive. It doesn't include people who are in congregate housing. It doesn't include women and children in unsafe housing situations. And I've looked up some of those numbers, and really we'd be looking at closer to 100,000 households who are in core housing need if we included those folks who aren't included right now in the census numbers on core housing need. Next slide, please, Valerie. We also are looking at particular priority populations because sometimes there's different needs for priority populations. So the highest proportion in Ottawa are new migrant households and refugee claimant households. And in almost every city across Canada and almost every province across Canada, single mother households are one of the highest proportions of households in core housing need. You'll see that even when it comes to household heads over 65 or 85, it's a little over 12% in the case of 65 and almost 18% of households over 85 are in core housing need. Next slide, please, Valerie. So what are some of the characteristics that we need to look at? Well, Valerie's already talked about accessibility, so people can age in place, affordable for people on fixed incomes, secure in tenure, so people don't get because of renovations or because of demolitions, well located for health, recreation, and shops. I just am giving one example of a kind of cool place because it uses government land to help provide affordable housing, and that's the Carlington Health Center with housing on top, 42 low-cost homes for seniors, 12 of them are barrier-free, and the other 30 are visitable. In other words, they may not have roll-in showers, but you can visit your neighbors. Each floor has a community space with a shared kitchen and a laundry. Of course, every unit has its own kitchen. There's a rooftop with raised garden beds and a large community space that can be rented out by the community, but also used for parties, etc., on the ground floor. That's the kind of housing we need to build much more of. Next slide, Valerie. I want to also mention an interesting place in Pentagouchene because it uses a Dutch model called the Hoogway model, which is dementia care, but it includes grocery stores and hairdressers and coffee shops and a mock beach and a putting green and a garage with a vintage car and a 5-to-1 staff to resident ratio. I know we're not focusing on long-term care tonight, but long-term care is a crisis. And wouldn't it be amazing to have that for every single 1.7 million Canadians facing Alzheimer's or other forms of memory loss? Those are the kinds of thinking for the future that we need to do. Next slide, Valerie. I'm just going to touch on this slide briefly because I know I'm running out of time. One of the big issues in Canada is that only 4% of the housing stock is nonprofit or non-market. If you look at, well, I just mentioned the Netherlands, 29% of the housing stock is nonprofit. That's a lot more that is for people's needs as opposed to a speculative investment. Sweden, if you count co-op housing, which is a huge sector in Sweden, closer to 41%. We need to be able to scale up social housing. Valerie, next slide. So how can we do that? Well, we're focusing tonight on municipal mechanisms, but it needs to be coordinated by all levels of government with similar definitions, with similar targets, etc. I'll give the example of France for a moment, where the target for every municipality is 20% nonprofit housing, and it's recently been raised in some cities, including Paris, to 30% nonprofit housing, and Paris is meeting those targets. So there needs to be targets linked to maximum affordable rents. There need to be federal grants because the federal government is the largest source of taxation money, and infrastructure to be free land from all levels of government. There needs to be accessibility targets and funding, and also energy efficiency targets so that we can meet a zero greenhouse gas future. There needs to be large-scale projects with linked federal money for public transit before and linked to development. At the municipal level, and I've highlighted these, there need to be neighborhood targets for non-market housing, linked to land use plans, and also linked to new social infrastructure. You can have housing with new parks, you can have housing with childcare, you can have housing with health centers. There needs to be an acquisitions plan to purchase buildings and land for large-scale non-market profits. I'm looking at places like Tunney's Pasture now. I wonder how much it's going to be redeveloped, how much of it is necessary to be office only, how much potential there is in that government-owned land. And of course, social assistance and services, which is really a provincial matter, need to be much more generous, and there need to be much better rent protections or renter protections. Final slide, Valerie. Yep, that's it for me. And thank you very much for the opportunity to speak tonight.
Thank you very much, Carolyn. That was a very interesting presentation with very sobering data on housing affordability in the city, and also the loss of affordable housing. The statistics you gave us certainly spoke to me quite loudly. We will be taking questions on this presentation, but first we will move on to the presentation by Jenny Brooks. And it is my pleasure to introduce Jenny. Jenny is the lead on the Council on Aging's Naturally Occurring Retirement Community Supportive Services Programs, or Norc SSP working group. She is the co-chair of the Age-Friendly Housing Committee. She is a retired nurse practitioner, an advocate with the Grandmothers Advocacy Network, and her presentation will touch on a very interesting model for age-friendly housing, the Norc SSP. And over to you, Jenny.
Thank you so much, Louise, and good evening, everyone. Norc, the new buzzword in the community, naturally occurring retirement communities. Most of you know what they are. Some of you may even live in one. A Norc is simply a geographic designation for a rental, condo building, or neighborhood block where 30 to 60% of residents are older adults, generally defined as people older than 55 years. Norcs become home to many older adults for a variety of reasons. People simply aged in place over the years and never thought to move. That would be us. Ease of mobility, the belief that it is too expensive to move, a desire to stay close to familiar services and amenities. So allow me to create a vision for you that is really my situation and could even be yours. I'm 73 years old. I live in the same two-story home I've lived in for the past 43 years with the same husband of 52 years. I'm active, engaged with my community. I travel, I ski, I hike, I drive my car. I volunteer, I enjoy book club. I see my friends and family on a regular basis. Will it always be so? A little voice whispers, no. One of us will develop dementia, have a stroke, fall down the stairs, fracture a hip. Then what? Do we install the infamous stair lift, widen our doors, install a full bathroom on the main floor? Do we move to a more expensive retirement home? Perhaps you already live in an apartment or condo, but now need more supports in order to remain there. Enter the innovative housing option that allows you to do just that. The Norc SSP Supportive Service Program that brings the supports to your door. A Norc SSP provides services, social, recreational, and sometimes health, to a particular Norc. These services are usually publicly funded. They may have additional private programs and services not covered by government, but the fees are calculated on a sliding scale based on income. The best example of a Norc SSP is the Oasis program in Kingston, Ontario, which we will be touching on a little later. Back to our vision. Imagine you've decided to make the move, and there is a rental apartment building in your neighborhood, one that is affordable, accessible, appropriate, and available. No need to renovate or leave your community. If the building offered the social, recreational, and house supports you now need with no loss of independence, you might consider moving. What are the essential elements of a Norc SSP? They have shared indoor space, ideally with a communal kitchen where residents can gather to cook and share meals if they so choose. There should also be a room for social and recreational activities like yoga, exercise classes, courses, and programs of resident choosing. Perhaps shared internet use for those who need assistance. A space for visiting health and social services. Shared outdoor space would be a real bonus, but is rarely found in new or older buildings. A patio would be ideal, along with a vegetable garden and barbecue where residents can gather. Finally, Norc SSPs are resident-led. They seek resident input regarding the use and management of the shared space and the supportive service programs. So why do we need Norc SSPs? As noted by Valerie, Ottawa's population of older adults greater than 65 is expected to reach 25% by 2035. We are a large and politically powerful group, folks. Preference and choices, 90% of older adults want to remain independent and age in their community. They would consider leaving their home if an appropriate, accessible, affordable, and available option existed in their community that provided the supports they now need. Norc SSPs are an affordable, proven alternative to moving to a more expensive retirement home. What are the social benefits of Norc SSPs? They are proven to reduce social isolation with its attendant health risks of cognitive decline, depressive symptoms, poor physical health due to decreased activity and poor diet. They provide older adults with opportunities to be productive and useful. For example, they can serve on the volunteer board of directors that decides in collaboration with residents which social, recreational, and health activities the Norc wants to provide. They can teach courses in their field of expertise to fellow residents at no cost. What are the economic benefits of Norc SSPs? It is much less expensive and more efficient to provide services to a building where a higher number of older adults live, as opposed to a single family dwelling. Norc SSPs may delay older adults moving to long-term care by keeping them supported and independent longer, a more cost-effective option for the healthcare system. Norc SSPs address housing, health, and social needs and reduce moving and relocation costs. Rental building owners report lower vacancy rates and higher renter satisfaction in Norc SSP buildings. For example, there is a 0% vacancy rate in Oasis buildings. Each has a long wait list. Why? Because residents love living there. The best example of a Norc SSP is the Oasis Senior Supportive Living, Kingston, Ontario. Oasis is a successful partnership between three groups: the residents of Bowling Green Apartment Complex, the property owner, Homestead Land Holdings, and what was formerly called the LIN, the Local Health Integration Network, who is the funder of the personal support worker who runs the social, recreational, and health programming. The Oasis program is so successful that Queen's University received a grant 4 years ago to expand this program to 6 new locations in Kingston, Toronto, Belleville, London, and Hamilton. I am absolutely thrilled to announce to you today that Ottawa will be the next Oasis expansion site. Ambleside Condominiums, in partnership with the Council on Aging and Old Forge Community Resource Center, made application to the Oasis expansion program in August of this year, and we received acceptance September 1st. Bravo to the Ambleside residents who worked so hard to make this happen. You can find more information about Oasis if you follow the links on the Norc fact sheet, which will be sent to you post-conference as part of a larger resource package. Finally, I want to tell you about a partnership between the Council on Aging and Ottawa Neighborhood Study. Together this past year, we produced a virtual interactive Ottawa Norc Finder map. This map will allow you to find all apartments and condo buildings in Ottawa that house older adults greater than 55 years. These are simply Norcs, remember, not Norc SSPs. They don't have the services. The map will not include retirement homes as they are not categorized as independent living. When you hover and click your cursor on a building within an Ottawa neighborhood, it will tell you the percentage of older adults living in that building. It will further provide a breakdown by age, sex, marital status, and language. We believe this map will be of use to service providers and researchers wanting to bring services to the Norcs where older adults already live, and to older adults who want to move to a building where a high percentage of older adults live. Stay tuned for our info flash in the months ahead, which will feature this new interactive map entitled "How Norky is Your Neighborhood?" So this concludes my talk. I believe we can make Norc SSPs an election issue. They are a cost-effective, socially responsible form of innovative housing that lies between your own home and a retirement home or long-term care. Let's educate our politicians and make Norc SSPs an option in every Ottawa community. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you, Jenny, for your excellent presentation. The Norc SSP is a very interesting model indeed. And thank you for sharing the good news on Ottawa being the next site for the Oasis project. We have some time for questions now. We have about, we can probably take about 10 minutes for some questions. on both Carolyn and Jenny's presentations. We have a couple of questions here. The first question is, what would the cost be? I believe that question is for Carolyn, and I believe that it was related to the number of initiatives that she was talking about, models in other countries. And the question is, what would the cost be for those initiatives being proposed? I don't know if it's an easy question to answer, but maybe you have a certain idea of what would be the
I would actually turn it around and say, what's the cost of not doing anything? So if you look at the downtown east side of Vancouver, where there's a very high proportion of people who are inadequately housed, and about 10 times as many Indigenous people as in the general population. The life expectancy is 15 years less than in the west side of Vancouver. If you look at evaluations of Housing First initiatives with people who are formerly homeless, they tend to deliver $2 in savings for every $1 spent on providing housing. So at the moment, we're spending a lot of money on emergency shelters, on emergency health care for people who are inadequately housed, on policing responses to people who are inadequately housed. And all of that money could be saved through putting money in permanent, adequate, accessible housing. So it's not even so much a magic number, it's a rights-based framework that says, wouldn't it make a lot more sense to put money in giving people decent lives than in sweeping up afterwards? It's sort of the same question to climate change. How much does it cost to, bring about zero greenhouse gases, as opposed to how much is it costing us every single day right now, not adequately dealing with climate change?
Okay, thank you. Second question for Carolyn. Based on your experience, your knowledge, you've done a lot of work in that area. What can we do to move forward the affordable housing agenda in Ottawa?
Well, tomorrow there's going to be the launch of a video for the It Starts With Home campaign that's being led by the Ottawa Coalition to End Homelessness. The Council on Aging is one of the 160 plus organizations that have signed on to It Starts With Home. So as a few people have mentioned in the comments, it sort of starts off with some targets. Over the last 10 years, there's been about 115 nonprofit subsidized homes provided per year in Ottawa, while many more have been lost. This would move things closer to 1,000 a year new affordable homes being created with the assistance of the City of Ottawa. So I guess from the perspective of a voter, it starts with asking your candidate questions about what they're going to do around affordable, accessible, adequate, appropriate housing. And with the new Ottawa Council, it's going to have to start with a look at what they can do, which is frankly a lot more than what it's currently doing, to preserve affordable housing and to create more affordable housing.
Thank you. Thank you very much. A question on Norc. What would stop a neighborhood from becoming a Norc?
Probably not a high enough percentage of older adults living in that particular area. A Norc by definition is 30 to 60% of older adults who have lived there for the number of reasons that we talked about earlier. So that would be the limiting factor in my mind, is certainly not enough people to qualify as being a Norc.
Okay. Another question for you, Jenny.
Mm.
Can you tell us more about whether age data is available for all condo buildings in Ottawa or only a select few that have been targeted for the study?
I'm assuming you're talking about the Norc map, right?
I
Yes.
believe so.
Okay, so the map will include all condos and apartment buildings, co-ops, any building that currently does not receive services and that houses residents who are over 55 years old. And there have to be 30 to 60% of them, again, to qualify as a Norc.
Okay, thank you very much. I believe we will need to move to the third part of our session, but we may have a bit more time at the end to answer more questions. There are a few other questions. So we'll move on to the next session now, which is the third part of tonight's event on how you can engage with the city. And it's my pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Peggy Edwards. Peggy is an active member and the former co-chair of the Council on Aging's Age-Friendly Housing Committee. She is a health promotion consultant, an activist for the rights of older people, a researcher, and an author on healthy aging. Now that we've become aware of the key issues related to housing for seniors, as well as opportunities and possibilities, we will now talk about the role that each and every one of us can play in encouraging action to be taken with the city. So Peggy, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Louise, for that introduction. And thank you to all of you for being here tonight. This has just been such a stimulating and rewarding conversation. My job now is to move us to action. Your voice is important. And together, we make an impressive choir. So as we go through the next 10 minutes, I'd ask you to please write in the chat box your response to the following question. When it comes to age-friendly housing, what is the priority that you want our new city council to address? Okay, so just a couple of words. When it comes to age-friendly housing, what is the priority that you want our new city council to address? And you've certainly heard from Valerie, and we'll look at it again, the priorities that the Council on Aging is recommending, but we'd like to hear from you, from your heart. What is the big issue that you want addressed? And we'll look at your responses a little later. So in the next few minutes, next slide, please. I'd like to address the who, the what, and the how for moving forward on action. And the next slide. Firstly, who? Who should we be talking with about the need for age-friendly housing? Well, we've come down to three large groups of people. First of all, your family, your friends, and your neighbors. Secondly, your networks and your community associates, and I would add your community associations. I know and would like to recognize that there are a number of people here on this webinar from community associations, and you have a really strong role to play in here in terms of the conversation. And thirdly, obviously, but probably most importantly, candidates for mayors and councillors. What are we going to be asking for? What are we going to be talking about? Well, to quickly review what you've heard from Valerie, the Council on Aging has 5 recommendations. And as Valerie said, you may have additional ones. But first of all, increasing the number of available and affordable housing options to match the older adults demographic. I mean, our council has to recognize that the demographic is changing and that the number of older people is increasing and their housing needs are increasing. Secondly, incorporate the principles of universal design. And here we're talking about the whole big A accessibility issue. Secondly, investing in innovative models. And you've heard some talk particularly from Jenny, about Norc Ssps as a great model, a great alternative model. But we've also, Carolyn and others have talked about things like shared living, cooperatives, and intergenerational living. Fourthly, to facilitate the coordination and expansion of services. And here we've heard about, in particularly, the expansion of quality home and community care services that will enable older people to stay in their homes. And lastly, to appoint an older adult advocate. This may be a new idea to some of our candidates who are running for election. It has been done in other municipalities, Toronto in particular. But appointing an older adult advocate at the municipal level with City Council, who would be a voice and be able to amplify the voice of older adults in all areas, housing included. So how are we going to do this? Here's some of our suggestions. First of all, this is an easy one. Talk with 5 people, a family member, a neighbor, maybe 3 friends. Talk with 5 people about what we've talked about tonight, about what you feel about age-friendly housing and what's most important. Secondly, spread the word through social media and at community places. I know a number of you will be going to gatherings with your ward, and spread the word, talk about age-friendly housing. Thirdly, obviously, talk with the candidates for mayor and city councillor. And there's a number of ways to do this: at the door, at meetings, and in gatherings. This can be in person. Don't forget by phone. We have found that phone conversations can be a very effective and time-effective way of talking to councillors and candidates. If you feel comfortable, ask for a meeting about this. Number 4, obviously vote, October 24. And 5, if you feel comfortable, submit a letter to the editor or a local media host. I know that in my community, the local community newspaper is a very effective way of addressing some of these issues. So it was mentioned earlier, and I would like to confirm that you don't have to write all this down. This will be sent to you right after the seminar tonight. But the platform for age-friendly housing will be sent to you, and the committee fact sheet on Norc Ssps. We need to amplify our voices. So print out and share the COA advocacy sheet. I heard from actually one of our committee members who mentioned that a candidate came to her door and she was ready to speak to her, but darn it, she'd forgotten to print out and share the advocacy. Valerie, you're smiling because it was you. So have it ready. Give it to your candidates. Share on Facebook, and we will be sending you the URL for the Council on Aging Facebook, where we'll have some messages. So it's easy. You don't have to create them. You just share them. Similarly on Twitter. And don't forget in your conversations to include both the mayoral and candidates for your ward. I'd like to emphasize the importance of looking at some of our partners and their proposals for age-friendly housing, for affordable, accessible housing. In particular, I know that there are some people with us tonight from the Alliance to End Homelessness, which is one of our key partners. The Ottawa Starts with Home campaign is a very effective and important campaign when looking at the affordability issue. CARP Ottawa has been a good partner in terms of looking at municipal election issues, including housing, and the Rendezvous des Années Francophones d'Ottawa. So these are just a few of our partners who have good things to say about what we want in housing in this election. There may be others online, and I salute you for being here. So look to the messages coming from those partners as well. Don't forget to vote. It's October 24, 2022. I'm actually traveling on that day, so I was really glad to see in my local community newspaper the ways that I can vote ahead of time. So make sure that you look at that. There is a list of candidates, and this will be sent to you at this website. We have also created a very simple template letter to candidates. So this is another easy way. Just copy and paste. Seriously, add your own thoughts and send it to the candidate. I've done this, and I've been really pleased with the number of people who have responded. So lastly, Louise, you'll have to look at our time, but could I ask Louise and Valerie, who've been looking at the chat box, what are some of the priorities that you're seeing that people want our newly elected council to address?
Okay, well, I can start, and Valerie can add on if she would like. Progress on Norc SSPs is one of the favorites. We've seen a lot of that being the number one priority. Inclusionary zoning and universal design requirements for new builds, making affordable housing available. And in one case, a person talked about ensuring that all older adults are in affordable housing. Commitment to a target of 30% for affordable housing. A Bill of Rights for housing for older adults, including responsibilities in relation to that Bill of Rights. Let's see. Senior advocate, one of the priorities that the Council on Aging has identified. Zero homelessness, that would be a good one. I would agree with that one, personally. Maybe a bit difficult to achieve, but it's certainly a good idea. Support for retrofitting for aging in place, good idea as well. City should focus on the services it offers to seniors, like transit, zoning to encourage innovating housing options, and making Ottawa a walkable city. Access to primary care and supportive services for residents and or caregivers. Advocate again, a senior older adult advocate. There are many. I think I will stop here, but it gives you an idea of some of the priorities that have come up. There's certainly good ideas that will help us in our own reflection as the Housing Committee. Would you like to add anything, Valerie or Peggy, before we move on?
If I could say two things, my goodness, that's a great list of priorities, and the council, we will be using that as we go further in our advocacy. So really thank you for those comments. One thing I'd like to talk about just very briefly is about this idea of the rights of older persons to age-friendly housing. And I think in that comment, it was particularly around the rights to shared housing. And there's been some interesting things happen in Ontario around this. In one community, for example, the neighborhood, the community was all against having a shared housing arrangement because they saw this as creating like a illegal seniors residence. And the city brought in a bylaw, and interestingly, called it the Golden Girls bylaw, that there is a right, people have a right to do shared housing, whether it is with students, whether it is with other older adults, etc. So I think that when these kinds of things come up, the municipality government has to really take a serious look at this and see if there is a need for bylaws related to these rights. Valerie, did you have anything to add?
I just, I think I really like the idea of setting targets. I think that's amazing that France is doing that and people have to adhere to these targets because there's too many ways that people can avoid building affordable housing by various loopholes and connections and who you know kind of thing. So I really, really like the idea. I think Montreal has also set targets, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah. And they set targets for various sizes of units and multi-generational units. And I just
it's 20% 3+ bedrooms, Valerie,
yeah.
and also 20% non-profit housing for all new developments above, I think 20 units. It's a very low cutoff rate. So yeah.
I'd like to see us follow that model, especially since we have so many large families coming into our cities, immigrant families who need larger homes, and we can't all live in these 25-story, 1-bedroom apartment kind of units that cost $1 zillion. I will bring up the point that someone did, just a couple of comments brought up long-term care quality, long-term care. And our hearts are with you entirely. Our focus, it's not that we're not focused on that, or we know that it's a huge, big issue to tackle. But this evening was on independent living. But we hear you, and there are others in the Council of Aging who are working on that issue.
Yes, I just like to reiterate that we did have a subcommittee on long-term care under the Health Issues Committee, and there were a number of very important documents produced by the council on that, which you can find on our website.
Well, thank you very much, Peggy, for animating this very interesting session. It was a very rich discussion indeed. We have a bit of time to answer some more questions before we wrap up. We have about 5 minutes or so. I am looking at some of the questions, and we'll pick perhaps 2 questions that could be answered. Here, okay, let me see. Okay, here's an interesting question. Okay. Are there Norcs that are designed as opposed to naturally occurring, especially ones that are based on townhouses or small houses with a front door, back door, sidewalk, and a small patch of land? And I guess that would be for Jenny.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I mean, Norcs generally occur naturally, and they can occur horizontally, meaning a neighborhood, or they can occur vertically, as in a condo building or an apartment building. But generally, they just happen. Older adults happen to be there, have lived there for many, many decades, and then all of a sudden they find that there's 30 to 60% of them that are older than 55. And that's our working definition of a Norc. A Norc is simply a geographic location where a high percentage of older adults greater than 55 years live. A Norc SSP is what we're advocating for. That's a supportive service program. So a Norc is simply a Norc. It means nothing. It's just a place where older people live. But we want to get the services in place. But in answer to your question, you could conceivably have a Norc that's in a neighborhood of townhomes where 30 to 60% of you are older adults.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Jenny. Here's another question, again, on the Oasis this time. Will the Oasis in Ottawa only be a condominium, which means residents own the condos rather than rent?
Definitely not. There are 7 different Oasis projects in Hamilton, Toronto, and all the cities I mentioned. One of them is actually a trailer park and consists of a neighborhood of trailers. There's apartment buildings, there's condominiums. So no, you do not have to be a condominium. You can be an apartment building. In fact, the first one that was formed 10 years ago by Christine McMillan in Toronto, in Kingston, is an apartment building, a Bowling Green.
Thank you very much. Other questions on Norcs, but I'll move on to another subject just so we can cover other areas as well. Why do we have this, and I don't know who would be able to answer this, so I'll open the floor to all panelists. Why do we have a 5 to 7 year waiting list for OCH while thousands of immigrants are being allowed into Canada and given housing? Where are the affordable housing units going to? Would anybody like to talk about the waiting list for the OCH?
Well, there's
Well,
a
that's
couple of
why,
different issues there, Louise. I mean, one of them is that about 95% of us who are non-Indigenous are either immigrants or descendants of immigrants. But absolutely, OCH is, in my estimation, as a housing policy analyst, probably the best, certainly one of the best public housing authorities in Canada. You know, there are some issues which OCH would be the first to say, that they don't provide supportive housing, so it can be a little hard for some of the seniors, but they bring in a lot of services. I live around the corner from a really great seniors building, Wellington Towers. I mean, there needs to be more. There were 10% of the housing that was built in the 70s were buildings like that one that I was just describing, Wellington Towers. And now it's less than 1% of the housing that's being built. And we have to bring back purpose-built affordable housing. It's as simple as that.
Thank you very much. And if I may, I'll ask one question for Caroline. You talked about the housing assessment resource tools that you are currently using to look at the situation, the housing situation, the needs, and to look at potential solutions. I'd be interested in hearing more about how this assessment resource tool, how they will be used, and how you can see that they can contribute to finding solutions for the housing situation in Ottawa and the province, of course.
Well, I guess the dream of heart, and it's only been a project for 2 years now, is that if governments start using a common language around affordable housing and around needs and about accessibility, et cetera, it's just going to be so much easier to get integrated policy. We simply cannot get out of the current crisis without all 3 levels of government working together better than they are. So we've found the city of Ottawa to be great partners on this project. We also meet on a regular basis, including today, with the CMHC and with Statistics Canada about the basis of what we're doing and how it might inform their policies. So it's intended to, I know people get kind of bored by data. I can understand that, and also a little depressed about data, but it's really important that we share the same facts and that we are able to, for instance, measure whether our policies, our strategies are working in the way that we said they would to end chronic homelessness and to reduce the number of households in housing need. So that's the mission of the Housing Assessment Resource Tools Project.
Well, thank you very much, Carolyn. We have reached the end of our time together. We have 1 minute left, so it's time to conclude. There are some questions that are left, and for those who want to stay on to hear answers to those questions, we can stay on for another 10 minutes after the conclusion. But for now, I will conclude the event. And I will start by thanking all of our speakers for their excellent presentations. And I would like to thank the Council on Aging team who has provided technical and content support to make tonight's event a reality. I think that you will agree with me that it was a very rich and very interesting exchange that we've had. A number of very important points were raised. I cannot even begin to summarize them, but if I may, I'd like to leave you with what I think are 3 important points. First, in the context of an aging population with rising needs for age-friendly housing options, it is essential to look at the full spectrum of innovative and cost-effective options for this population. Age-friendly housing is an issue for all ages, and when the housing needs of older adults are met, they are better able to give back to their community. Second, the Council on Aging did an analysis of the key issues and made a number of recommendations to the city, and we invite you to advance those recommendations. I won't go over them. We've talked about them a number of times, but they touch some very important issues that need to be addressed. Third, every one of us can play a role. We can use our voice to call for change. We can do it in the context of the upcoming election and beyond, and I would invite you to do so. I'd like to thank you for your participation, and I hope that you enjoyed this session. And as was mentioned earlier, we will be sending early next week an email with the presentation materials, a link to the recording of tonight's session, as well as link to key resources. Thank you again for your participation, and good night. Bonsoir et merci. And now for the people who want to stay on, we can continue and answer the other questions that haven't been answered as of now. First question, who determines the percentage that makes it possible to become a Norc? And I guess that's for you.
Okay, this has been a question that has been batted around for a very long time, and researchers and authors can't seem to agree if it's 30%, 45%, 50%, 60%. So we've settled on a 30 to 60% of older adults make up a Norc. So that's the working definition based on many researchers' input. So 30 to 60, I know it's a broad range, but if you're less than 30, my understanding is you are not a Norc. You are not a naturally occurring retirement community. Your numbers have to be slightly higher.
Okay, thank you. Again, link to the Norcs. It certainly has generated a lot of interest. Some retirement homes are developing condo rental buildings for independent seniors, such as the Alaveda on Central Park, for example. How do these differ from Norcs?
That's an interesting question. I must say I don't know about these buildings, but certainly if they're independent living and they're apartments and they're going to be provided services, I suppose they're a Norc in the sense that they have the population of older adults living there that define a Norc. But I really don't know much about these apartments, I'm afraid.
Thank you. Here's a general question, and whoever wants to answer. Many of the solutions being suggested will cost governments a lot of money. While lower income seniors want to see these implemented, many higher income seniors who own their own homes do not want to see their taxes go up too much. How do you square this circle? Difficult question to answer.
Well, I would take a stab at that, in that I think some of the options that are being put forward are not expensive. If you think about co-housing or co-living or Norcs, these are not expensive options. These are actually going to save governments money. by, I mean, Oasis, for instance, is funded through usually the LIN, or in the case of Old Forge, it's a community resource center. And it's simply, they get funded the salary of a PSW, which isn't all that high, really, to provide recreation and social programs to a particular building. So it's actually a very cost-effective model, as I would think the Golden Girls, the co-living, the co-housing models are also very cost-effective. So I think this question probably relates to the building of houses that follow universal design principles and that kind of thing. That could be pricier, but needed.
Actually, building design doesn't cost that much more if it's included in the initial building. And we have to look at our society as it changes. More and more of us may require those special interventions or special features in our homes as we age. And so to have them built initially, which they're doing in France as well. In France, you have to put a main bedroom on the main floor, and you have to have a bathroom on the main floor in your new building. So building, when we look at our society, it's so diverse that yes, we don't want our taxes to go up enormously, but if we don't build for the 21st century and the number of people that are coming to live in cities, we're going to have homelessness, we're going to have increased violence, increased health issues. So when you have a place to rest your head at night and a home, it improves health, it improves relationships, it improves the whole vibrancy and health of our cities. So, you know, I don't know. I know we have to decide where we want our tax dollars to go as well.
The other thing I was going to add to that, Valerie, is universal design is not directed strictly at older adults. It's directed at anyone with a disability. So you know, if you're a young person who has an accident and becomes a paraplegic, you need universal design. So this is not a feature that's just directed at older adults. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. Yes,
can I add something there? You know, the majority of older adults in Ottawa are of moderate income. And seriously, when you're moderate income, staying and owning your own house is really difficult. I'll just use my example. Okay, I live alone and I owned a house, 3-story house, which I loved. But the only way I could afford it, including the taxes, was to rent out the bottom unit, the bottom area, to a student. And that worked extremely well, allowed me to pay my taxes. In the end, I decided to downsize and move to a smaller accommodation so that I could afford. So I think this whole issue of our taxes and housing, seriously, moderate income older people are having a great deal of problems staying in their own homes, and maybe those homes are too big for them. So we need better options in terms of, you know, age-friendly housings that we can move to.
Yeah.
thank you. Maybe one last question, because we're almost at the 10-minute mark. It's a simple one. Maybe one of you is able to answer that. If my building doesn't have any age data, is there something I can do to get this data?
If my building doesn't have what, Louise?
Age data in relation to age. I think it's linked to the Norc. It's linked to the idea of having a certain percentage of the residents being older adults. So you're interested in finding out how are they able to find out if the building in which they live it meets the criteria for Norc.
Okay, that data that we're using to create this interactive website is obtained from the census data. And so that's how that data is arrived at. It's not residents of a building running around trying to figure out how many people live there that are older 55 and breaking that down. That's provided through the census. And so this will change when we get the 2021 census data in and applied to all the apartment condo buildings in Ottawa.
Okay. Thank you very much. There are a couple of more questions, but I think we've taken as much time as we could. So we will conclude now. Thank you for those of you who have stayed on with us. And thank you for your participation. And thank you again to the panelists. That was really, really a wonderful, very interesting evening with a lot of very good information. And I think it was a rich and full discussion. So good night to everyone.
Good night.
Good night.
Good night.